It's about time I get my hind end in here and read, yo. Sorry. In the midst of whatever chapter, you see it on the title. Our tennis court has not been played on for years. Neither Richard nor I play. I suppose later when the boys grow up, Megan will find plenty to do. She's quite happy just pottering about, you know. Let me see, did I deal? 2 no trumps. As we drove home, Joanna said, with a vicious pressure on the accelerator pedal that made the car leap forward, I feel awfully sorry for that girl. Megan? Yes, her mother doesn't like her. Oh, come now, Joanna, it's not as bad as that. Yes, it is. Lots of mothers don't like their children. Megan, I should imagine, is an awkward sort of creature to have about the house. Lots of mothers don't like their children. God bless them. To have about the house. She disturbs the pattern, the Symington pattern. It's a complete unit without her, and that's a most unhappy feeling for a sensitive creature to have, and she is sensitive. Yes, I said, I think she is. I was silent a moment. Joanna suddenly laughed mischievously. Bad luck for you about the governess. I don't know what you mean, I said with dignity. Nonsense. Masculine chagrin was written on your face every time you looked at her. I agree with you. It's a waste. I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm delighted all the same. It's the first sign of reviving life. I was quite worried about you at the nursing home. You never even looked at that remarkably pretty nurse you had. An attractive minx, too. Absolutely God's gift to a sick man. Your conversation, Joanna, I find definitely low, my sister continued, without paying the least attention to my remarks. So I was much relieved to see you'd still got an eye for a nice bit of skirt. She is a good looker. Funny that the S.A., and that's the abbreviation, an S, capital A, should have been left out completely. It's odd, you know, Jerry. What is the thing that some women have and others haven't? What is it makes one woman, even if she only says foul weather, so attractive that every man within range wants to come over and talk about the weather with her? I suppose Providence makes a mistake every now and then when sending out the parcel. One Aphrodite face and form, one temperament ditto, and something goes astray and the Aphrodite temperament goes to some little plain-faced creature, and then all the other women go simply mad and say, I can't think what the men see in her. She isn't even good-looking. Have you quite finished, Joanna? Well, you do agree, don't you? I grinned. I'll admit to disappointment. And I don't see who else there is here for you. You'll have to fall back upon Amy Griffith. God forbid, I said. She's quite good looking, you know. Too much of an Amazon for me. She seems to enjoy her life all right, said Joanna. Absolutely disgustingly hearty, isn't she? I shouldn't be at all surprised if she had a cold bath every morning. And what are you going to do for yourself? I asked. Me? Yes, you'll need a little distraction down here if I know you. Who's being low now? Besides, you forget, Paul. Joanna heaved up a not very convincing sigh. I shan't forget him nearly as quickly as you will. In about 10 days you'll be saying, Paul? Paul who? I never knew a Paul. You think I'm completely fickle, said Joanna. When people like Paul are in question, I'm only too glad that you should be. Sorry. I ate some crackers with Little sesame seeds on them, and they're everywhere. You never did like him, but he really was a bit of a genius. Possibly, though I doubt it. Anyway, from all I've heard, geniuses are people to be heartily disliked. One thing you won't find any geniuses down here. Swallow. Joanna considered for a moment, her head on one side. "I'm afraid not," she said regretfully. "You'll have to fall back upon Owen Griffith," I said. "He's the only unattached male in the place, unless you count old Colonel Appleton. He was looking at you like a hungry bloodhound most of the afternoon." Joanna laughed. "He was, wasn't he? It was quite embarrassing." "Don't pretend. You're never embarrassed." Joanna drove in silence through the gate and round to the garage. She said then, "There may be something in that idea of yours." "What idea?" Joanna replied, "I don't see why any man should deliberately cross the street to avoid me. It's rude, apart from anything else." "I see," I said. "You're going to hunt the man down in cold blood?" "Well, I don't like being avoided." I got slowly and carefully out of the car and balanced my sticks. Then I offered my sister a piece of advice. "Let me tell you this, my girl. Owen Griffith isn't any of your tame, whining, artistic young men. Unless you're careful, you'll stir up a hornet's nest about your ears. That man could be dangerous." "Oh, do you think so?" demanded Joanna with every symptom of pleasure at the prospect. "Please leave the poor devil alone," I said sternly. "How dare he cross the street when he saw me coming?" "All you women are alike. You harp on one theme, you'll have Sister Amy gunning you too, if I'm not mistaken." "She dislikes me already," said Joanna. She spoke meditatively. Oh, Agatha likes that word. But with a certain satisfaction. "We have come down here," I said sternly, "for peace and quiet, and I mean to see we get it." But peace and quiet were the last things we were to have. Now I know where we are. That was the end of chapter 3. I'll go on to 4. If I can quit harking long enough. I was feeling so good, I quit taking my Zyrtec. Wrong move. Symptoms immediately came back, but not a sore throat. Not yet. So I'm going to keep taking it. Okay, chapter 4. It was, I think, about a week later that Partridge informed me that Mrs. Baker would like to speak to me for a minute or two, if I would be so kind. The name Mrs. Baker conveyed nothing at all to me. "Who was Mrs. Baker?" I said, bewildered. "Can't she see Miss Joanna?" But it appeared that I was the person with whom an interview was desired. It further transpired that Mrs. Baker was the mother of the girl Beatrice. I'd forgotten about Beatrice. For a fortnight now I had been conscious of a middle-aged woman with wisps of gray hair, usually on her knees, retreating crab-like from bathroom and stairs and passages when I appeared. And I knew, I suppose, that she was our new daily woman. Otherwise, the Beatrice complication had faded from my mind. I could not very well refuse to see Beatrice's mother, especially as I learned that Joanna was out, but I was, I must confess, a little nervous at the prospect. I sincerely hoped that I was not going to be accused of having trifled with Beatrice's affections. I cursed the mischievous activities of anonymous letter writers to myself at the same time as, aloud, I commanded that Beatrice's mother should be brought to my presence. Mrs. Baker was a big, broad, weather-beaten woman with a rapid flow of speech. I was relieved to notice no signs of anger or accusation. "I hope, sir," she said, beginning at once when the door had closed behind Partridge, "that you'll excuse the liberty I've taken in coming to see you. But I thought, sir, as you was the proper person to come to, and I should be thankful if you could see your way to telling me what I ought to do in the circumstances. Because, in my opinion, sir, something ought to be done, and I've never been one to let the grass grow under my feet, and what I say is, no use moaning and groaning, but up and doing, as Vickers said in his sermon only the week before last." I felt slightly bewildered and as though I had missed something essential in the conversation. "Certainly," I said. "Won't you sit down, Mrs. Baker? I'm sure I should be glad to help you any way I can." I paused expectantly. "Thank you, sir." Mrs. Baker sat down on the edge of a chair. "It's very good of you, I'm sure, and glad I am that I came to you. I said to Beatrice, I said, and her howling and crying on her bed, 'Mr. Burton will know what to do,' I said, being a London gentleman. And something must be done, what with young men being so hot-headed and not listening to reason the way they are, and not listening to a word a girl says. And anyway, if it was me," I says to Beatrice, "I'd give him as good as I got. And what about that girl down at the mill?" I felt more than ever bewildered. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I don't quite understand what has happened." "It's the letters, sir. Wicked letters. Indecent, too, using such words and all. Worse than I've ever seen in the Bible, even." Passing over an interesting sideline here, I said desperately, "Has your daughter been having more letters?" "Not her, sir. She just had the one. That one, as was the occasion of her leaving here." "There was absolutely no reason," I began, but Mrs. Baker firmly and respectfully interrupted me. "There's no need to tell me, sir, that what was wrote was all wicked lies. I had Miss Partridge's word for that, and indeed I would have known it for myself. You aren't that type of gentleman, sir." "That I well know, and you an invalid and all. Wicked, untruthful lies it was, but all the same, I says to Beatrice as she'd better leave, because you know what talk is, sir. No smoke without fire, that's what people say, and a girl can't be too careful. And besides, the girl herself felt bashful like after what had been written, so I says, 'Quite right,' to Beatrice when she said she wasn't coming up here again. Though I'm sure we both regretted the inconvenience being such." Unable to find her way out of the sentence, Mrs. Baker took a deep breath and began again, and that, I hoped, would be the end of the nasty talk. But now, George, down at the garage, him what Beatrice is going with, he's got one of them. He's got one of them, saying awful things about Beatrice and how she's going on with Fred Ledbetter's Tom. I can assure you, sir, the girl has been no more than civil to him and passing the time of day, so to speak." My head was now reeling under this new complication of Mr. Ledbetter's Tom. "Let me get this straight," I said. "Beatrice's young man has had an anonymous letter making accusations about her and another young man?" "That's right, sir, and not nicely put at all. Horrible words used. And it drove young George mad with rage, it did. And he came round and told Beatrice he wasn't going to put up with that sort of thing from her. He wasn't going to have her go behind his back with other chaps. And she says it's all a lie. And he says no smoke without fire. And rushes off, being hot like in his temper. And Beatrice, she took on ever so, poor girl. And I said, I'll put my hat on and come straight up to you, sir. Mrs. Baker paused and looked at me expectantly, like a dog waiting for a reward after doing a particularly clever trick. But why come to me? I demanded. I understood, sir, that you'd had one of these nasty letters yourself, and I thought, sir, that being a London gentleman, you'd know what to do about them. If I were you, I said, I should go to the police. This sort of thing ought to be stopped. Mrs. Baker looked deeply shocked. Oh, no, sir, I couldn't go to the police. Why not? I've never been mixed up with the police before, sir. None of us ever have. Probably not, but the police are the only people who can deal with this sort of thing. It's their business. Go to Bert Rundle? Bert Rundle was the constable, I knew. There's a sergeant or an inspector surely at the police station. Me go into the police station? Mrs. Baker's voice expressed reproach and incredulity. I began to feel annoyed. That's the only advice I can give you. Mrs. Baker was silent, obviously quite unconvinced. She said wistfully and earnestly, "These letters ought to be stopped, sir. They did ought to be stopped. There'll be mischief done sooner or later." "It seems to me there's mischief done now," I said. "I mean violence, sir. These young fellas, they get violent in their feelings, and so do the older ones." I asked, "Are a good many of these letters going about?" Mrs. Baker nodded. "It's getting worse and worse, sir. Mr. and Mrs. Beadle, Beadle, at the Blue Boar, very happy they've always been, and now these letters come, and sets them thinking things that aren't so, sir." I leaned forward. "Mrs. Baker," I said, "have you any idea at all, who's writing these abominable letters?" To my great surprise, she nodded her head. "We've got our ideas, sir. Yes, we've all got a very fair idea." "Who is it?" I had fancied she might be reluctant to mention a name, but she replied promptly, "'Tis Mrs. Cleet." Cleat. "That's what we all think, sir. 'Tis Mrs. Cleet, for sure." I had heard so many names this morning that I was quite bewildered. I asked, "Who is Mrs. Cleet?" Mrs. Cleet, I discovered, was the wife of an elderly jobbing gardener. She lived in a cottage on the road leading down to the mill. My further questions only brought unsatisfactory answers. Questions as to why Mrs. Cleet should write these letters. Mrs. Baker would only say, vaguely, that T would be like her. T would be like her. Like capital T. In the end, I let her go, reiterating once more my advice to go to the police, advice which I could see Mrs. Baker was not going to act upon. I was left with the impression that I had disappointed her. Might as well let that clock chime. I never pay attention to what time it is when I get on here. 9 bells. P.M. P.M. Vice Justice, I was left with the impression I disappointed. Okay. I thought over what she had said. Vague as the evidence was, I decided that if the village was all agreed that Mrs. Cleet was the culprit, then it was probably true. I decided to go and consult Griffith about the whole thing. Presumably he would know this Cleet woman. If he thought advisable, he or I might suggest to the police that she was at the bottom of this growing annoyance. I timed my arrival for about the moment I fancied Griffith would have finished his surgery. When the last patient had left, I went into the surgery. Hello, it's you, Burton. I outlined my conversation with Mrs. Baker and passed on to him the conviction that this Mrs. Cleet was responsible. Rather to my disappointment, Griffith shook his head. It's not so simple as that, he said. You don't think this Cleet woman is at the bottom of it? She may be, but I should think it's most unlikely. Then why do they all think it's her? He smiled. Oh, he said, you don't understand. Mrs. Cleet is the local witch. Good gracious, I exclaimed. Yes, sounds rather strange nowadays. Nevertheless, that's what it amounts to. The feeling lingers, you know, that there are certain people, certain families, for instance, whom it isn't wise to offend. Mrs. Cleet came from a family of wise women, and I'm delighted she's taken pains to cultivate the legend. She's a queer woman with a bitter and sardonic sense of humor. It's been easy enough for her. If a child cut its finger, had a bad fall, or sickened with the mumps, to nod her head and say, yes, he stole my apples last week, or he pulled my cat's tail. Soon enough, mothers pulled their children away, and other women brought honey or a cake they'd baked to give to Mrs. Cleet, so as to keep on the right side of her, so that she shouldn't ill wish them. It's superstitious and silly, but it happens. So naturally now they think she's at the bottom of this. But she isn't. Oh no, she isn't the type. It's not so simple as that. Haven't you any idea? I looked at him curiously. He shook his head, but his eyes were absent. No, he said, I don't know it all, but I don't like it, Burton. Some harm is going to come of this. And this is the second part of the chapter. When I got back to the house, I found Megan sitting on the veranda steps, her chin resting on her knees. She greeted me with her usual lack of ceremony. Hello, she said. Do you think I could come to lunch? Certainly, I said. If it's chops or anything difficult like that and they won't go around, just tell me, shouted Megan, as I went round to apprise Partridge of the fact that there would be 3 to lunch. I fancy that Partridge sniffed. She certainly managed to convey without saying a word of any kind that she didn't think much of that Miss Megan. I went back to the veranda. Is it quite all right? I asked Megan anxiously. Quite all right, I said. Irish stew. Oh, well, that's rather like dog's dinner anyway, isn't it? I mean, it's mostly potato and flavor. Quite, I said. I took out my cigarette case and offered it to Megan. She flushed. Oh, How nice of you. Well, won't you have one? No, I don't think I will, but it was very nice of you to offer it to me just as though I was a real person. Aren't you a real person? I said, amused. Megan shook her head, then changing the subject. She stretched out a long dusty leg for my inspection. I've darned my stockings, she announced proudly. I'm not an authority on darning, but it did occur to me that the strange puckered blot of violently contrasting wool was perhaps not quite a success. It's much more uncomfortable than the hole, said Megan. It looks as though it might be, I agreed. Does your sister darn well? I tried to think if I'd ever observed any of Joanne's handiwork in this way. I don't know, I had to confess. Well, what does she do when she gets a hole in her stocking? I rather think, I said reluctantly, that she throws them away and buys another pair. Very sensible, said Megan, but I can't do that. I get an allowance now. 40 pounds a year. You can't do much on that. I agreed. Good gravy. If only I wore black stockings, I could ink my legs, said Megan sadly. That's what I always did at school. Miss Batworthy, the mistress who looked after our mending, was like her name, blind as a bat. It was awfully useful. It must have been, I said. We were silent while I smoked my pipe. It was quite a companionable silence. Megan broke it by saying suddenly and violently, I suppose you think I'm awful like everyone else? I was so startled that my pipe fell out of my mouth. It was a mere sham, just coloring nicely, and it broke. I said angrily to Megan, now see what you've done? I guess the pipe. He's talking about the pipe. That most unaccountable of children, instead of being upset, merely grinned broadly. I do like you, she said. It was a most warming remark. It is the remark that one fancies, perhaps erroneously, that one's dog would say if it could talk. It occurred to me that Megan, for all she looked like a horse, had the disposition of a dog. She was certainly not quite human. What did you say before the catastrophe? I asked, carefully picking up the fragments of my cherished pipe. I said I supposed you thought me awful, said Megan, but not at all in the same tone she had said it before. Why should I? Megan said gravely. Because I am. I said sharply, don't be stupid. Megan shook her head. That's just it. I'm not really stupid. People think I am. They don't know that inside I know just what they're like. And that all the time I'm hating them. Hating them? Yes, said Megan. Her eyes, those melancholy, unchildlike eyes, stared straight into mine without blinking. It was a long, mournful gaze. You would hate people if you were like me, she said. If you weren't wanted. Don't you think you've been rather morbid? I asked. Yes, said Megan. That's what people always say when you're saying the truth, and it is true. I'm not wanted, and I can quite see why. Mummy doesn't like me a bit. I remind her, I think, of my father, who was cruel to her, and pretty dreadful, from all I can hear. Only mothers can't say they don't want their children and just go away or eat them. Cats eat the kittens they don't like. Awfully sensible, I think. No waste or mess. But human mothers have to keep their children and look after them. It hasn't been so bad while I could be sent away to school, but you see what Mummy would be real. But you see what Mummy would really like is to be just herself and my stepfather and the boys, I said slowly. I still think you're morbid, Megan, but accepting some of what you say is true, why don't you go away and have a life of your own? She gave me an unchildlike smile. You mean take up a career, earn my living? She gave, earn my living. Yes. What at? You could train for something, I suppose. Shorthand, typing, bookkeeping. I don't believe I could. I'm stupid about doing things. And besides, well, she had turned her face away. Now she turned it slowly back again. It was crimson, and there were tears in her eyes. She spoke now with all the childishness back in her voice. Why should I go away and be made? Why should I? And be made to go away? They don't want me, but I'll stay. I'll stay and make everyone sorry. I'll make them all sorry, hateful pigs. I hate everyone here in Limstock. They all think I'm stupid and ugly. I'll show them. I'll show them. It was a childish, ugly, pathetic rage. I heard a step on the gravel round the corner of the house. Get up, I said savagely. Go into the house through the drawing room. Go up to the first floor to the bathroom. Into the passage. Wash your face, quick. She sprang awkwardly to her feet and darted through the window as Joanna came round the corner of the house. Gosh, I'm hot, she called out. She sat down beside me and fanned her face with the Tyrolean scarf that had been round her head. Still, I think I'm educating these damned brogues now. I've walked miles. I've learned one thing. You shouldn't have these fancy holes in your brogues. The gorse prickles go through. Do you know, Jerry, I think we ought to have a dog. So do I said. By the way, Megan is coming to lunch. Is she? Good. You like her? I asked. I think she's a changeling, said Joanna. Something left on a doorstep, you know, while the fairies take the right one away. It's very interesting to meet a changeling. I must go up and wash. You can't yet, I said. Megan is washing. Oh, she's been foot slogging too, has she? Joanna took out her mirror and looked at her face long and earnestly. I don't think I'll like this lipstick, she announced presently. Megan came out through the window. She was composed, moderately clean, and showed no signs of the recent storm. She looked doubtfully at Joanna. Hello, said Joanna, still preoccupied by her face. I'm so glad you've come to lunch. Good gracious, I've got a freckle on my nose. I must do something about it. Freckles are so earnest and Scottish. Partridge came out and said coldly that luncheon was served. Come on, said Joanna, getting up. I'm starving. She put her arm through Megan's and they went into the house together. And that's it. So I read the end of 3 and all of 4. And didn't go to sleep. Woo! All right, boys and girls. She'll see you in the YT streets until tomorrow at 3. We'll have a little giveaway at the end. Talk about some more fiber. I dig up some more fiber to show you guys. I'm making a mess pulling stuff out. And it not wanting to go back in right. I bought a cubby unit, but I got to get it put together. I need my Hannah banana over here. Love y'all. Be sweet, don't be ugly. See you soon. Bye-bye.